Remember what is written in your school history textbooks. July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong takes his famous giant leap for mankind. The whole world clung to their television screens, swallowing tears of awe. A triumph of science, a celebration of peace. But what if I told you that this step was a colossal fabrication? No, I am not claiming the flight didn't happen. I am claiming that the manned moon landing was a brilliant global PR campaign, covering up the deployment of the first orbital killer satellites. Welcome to the real history of the Cold War. While you were looking at the stars, Pentagon generals were looking at Earth through the crosshairs of entirely new systems of total annihilation. Open the declassified archives of the National Security Agency. Document number 73/16 from August 1965. The Directive on Military Space Intelligence Priorities. Officially, America is spending billions to build the massive Saturn V rocket. The press writes breathlessly about lunar soil and futuristic spacesuits for peaceful explorers of the void. But now, take a look at these financial reports. Civilian space absorbed the world's full attention, acting as the perfect smokescreen. It was a flawless financial and media diversion. Behind the scenes of this theater of the absurd, real, colossal black budgets were draining into completely different offices, into the cramped rooms of the U.S. National Reconnaissance Office. Robert McNamara, United States Secretary of Defense, a cynical and calculating technocrat, cared least of all about lunar craters. His sole interest was controlling the missile silos of the Soviet Union. And so, in 1963, the Pentagon initiates Project MOL, Manned Orbiting Laboratory. Sounds quite harmless and scientific, doesn't it? In reality, the project, under the secret codename Dorian, was a heavy military station. It was designed to hover in low Earth orbit, equipped with optical hardware of unbelievable resolution. And not just with cameras. Declassified documents reveal detailed plans to equip these stations with systems to intercept foreign spacecraft and command massive orbital bombardments. For the public, NASA sincerely smiled and waved at the astronauts of the civilian Gemini program. In reality, Gemini capsules were hurriedly adapted for the MOL project to deliver military crews. The U.S. Air Force was quietly selecting its own classified astronauts. Their names weren't printed on the front pages of newspapers. They weren't invited to talk shows. They were preparing for a real orbital war. Why, then, was the grueling lunar program necessary? It is extremely simple. If you start launching heavy rockets en masse from military bases, it causes public panic. But if you announce the noble goal of conquering the moon, any massive budget expenditures and colossal rockets on launch pads become a matter of unconditional national pride. The space race became the greatest diversionary tactic of the 20th century, the ultimate magic trick. The illusionist shows you the moon with his right hand, while his left hand quietly cocks the trigger of a global nuclear arsenal. Politicians spoke from high podiums about world peace. Meanwhile, in the basements of Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas corporations, engineers worked without weekends, assembling components for space espionage. The Soviet Union, naturally, played by the exact same cynical rules. Moscow didn't just stumble into this race. The Politburo perfectly understood the true purpose of the heavy American rockets. In the closed design bureaus of the USSR, academician Vladimir Chelomey was developing the Almaz station. On paper for the West, it was the peaceful Salyut laboratory. In reality, it was a combat orbital observation post for the Ministry of Defense. On board this Soviet station was an automatic Noodleman Richter cannon. Yes, you heard that right. Real large-caliber artillery was mounted in Earth's orbit to shoot down foreign satellites. This was a ruthless, invisible game of survival. Each of the superpowers strove to seize the high ground of near-Earth orbit first, in order to control the launches of the enemy's intercontinental ballistic missiles. No one in their right mind intended to plant apple orchards on Mars or colonize lunar plains. Those fairy tales were left for gullible journalists and the taxpayers funding the banquet. Look at the structure of NASA's budget between 1964 and 1969. Colossal. Entirely unjustified sums were written off under the abstract heading of research and development. But where exactly did this gigantic money go? A portion of the technologies, supposedly tested for historic flights to the moon, went straight into the guidance systems of the newest ballistic missiles. The famous Apollo guidance computer, created in the laboratories of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, became the foundation for miniaturizing the control systems of the US Navy. In other words, every dollar you invested in the peaceful conquest of space actually worked to improve the mathematical precision of delivering thermonuclear warheads to Moscow and Leningrad. The moon race was just a gigantic, incredibly expensive proving ground. A proving ground where, away from the prying eyes of the press, technologies for docking, maneuvering, and life support for future orbital battle platforms were perfected. In 1969, the military project MOL was officially cancelled, allegedly due to financial reasons. But that was just another elegant lie for the general public. It wasn't cancelled. It was simply and quietly transformed into the Keyhole program of unmanned reconnaissance satellites. Humans were replaced by high-precision optics and sensors. These devices, the size of a commercial bus, had mirrors comparable to the Hubble Space Telescope. Only they weren't looking at distant galaxies, but straight into the concrete windows of Soviet bunkers. The superpowers cynically used lunar romance to completely militarize near-Earth orbit, without a single serious protest from the hippie movement and global pacifists. You want to take to the streets of Washington with placards against the bloody Vietnam War? Go ahead. And meanwhile, we will seamlessly deploy an early warning system right above your heads. The DSP system, Defense Support Program. Satellites that detect infrared radiation from missile launches. Their covert deployment began in the early 70s, in the saving shadow of the fading Apollo program. Outer space became a completely new, bottomless expanse for the cruisers of an invisible fleet. And this happened at the exact moment Neil Armstrong was returning to Earth as a hero. Remember the famous handshake in space? The joint Soviet-American Apollo-Soyuz program of '75. Officially, it was the end of the space race, a bright symbol of détente and friendship among nations. Unofficially, both sides clearly understood that further build-up of manned military stations would lead to an accidental technical incident that would immediately trigger World War III, right in space. They simply agreed on a strict division of spheres of influence in orbit. A truce not for the sake of abstract peace, but to maintain the status quo. The balance of nuclear terror was shifted hundreds of miles upward. Open any advanced physics textbook. If you securely control high orbit, you no longer need complex missiles to guarantee the destruction of a strategic target on Earth. The idea of rods from God, heavy tungsten kinetic projectiles dropped from orbit and striking with the destructive force of a tactical nuclear charge without the radiation. This concept was born precisely in those offices.
Intelligence analysts fully realized, whoever controls the orbit unconditionally controls the entire world. The moon was just a bright, shiny toy thrown to the crowd to distract them from this terrifying fact. And it worked flawlessly. We still naively celebrate the anniversaries of the landing, watch colorful documentaries about the courage of astronauts, and proudly buy T-shirts with the blue NASA logo. No one buys T-shirts with the logo of the National Reconnaissance Office. No one shoots Hollywood blockbusters about the Kennan series satellites, which silently tracked humanity's every move for decades. History, as we know, is written by the victors in global PR wars. The true architects of the space age remained forever in the shadows, locked in dusty archives stamped with a red "Top Secret." Generals like Bernard Schriever, who rigidly oversaw all U.S. military space programs, knew the exact price of these lunar expeditions. For them, endless space was merely a new theater of military operations. The result of this grandiose, multi-year cover operation is frightening in its absolute mundanity. We are used to unconditionally believing in a peaceful, purely exploratory space, full of romance and bright hopes for the future. We trustingly look up at the dark night sky and dream of distant, uncharted stars, of contact with other civilizations, of that distant day when we will fly to other nebulas. But the cold reality is that for half a century now, an invisible, dense shield of weapons of mass destruction and total, relentless surveillance of every square meter has been hanging directly above our heads. Thousands of fragments from secret anti-satellite weapon tests, the husks of burned-out reconnaissance platforms, and forgotten black military projects silently orbit in the icy void of space. The space race was never, not for a single day, a competition for pure scientific discovery. It was the first, most important phase of the militarization of the space around our planet, conducted to deafening applause. The moon landing is not a giant leap for mankind. It is the greatest optical illusion in history, cold-bloodedly planned by analytical minds in the closed sectors of the Pentagon and CIA headquarters. The next time you see a bright dot drifting slowly and silently across a clear night sky, do not rush to make a wish. It is quite possible that right now, it is staring closely back at you. The global elites played their geopolitical game flawlessly. They gave us a beautiful fairy tale about brave heroes in white spacesuits, and in return, they permanently seized the monopoly on absolute orbital dictate. The curtain has long fallen, but this terrifying orbital play continues every single day. And the scariest part of this story is that we, ignorant of the truth, are still applauding this smokescreen.